When I first started drawing, I drew architecture, grand architecture. But before long, I discovered grand architecture often has grand trees around it. But fortunately, I love trees and I love drawing them as much as architecture. However, I soon realised that trees were a subject many people found particularly difficult to draw, even to the point of trying to avoid them, the same way I had tried to avoid drawing cars and people in my streetscapes. But this got me thinking, why are trees not a problem for me to draw? And I worked out I had a secret advantage over most people in drawing them. Let me share it with you, and I hope it helps you find a way to find as much joy in drawing trees as I found. And this is it. Here is my secret advantage. Post-school, I started art late in life, when I was 50. And unusually, I didn't really start with drawing, but with painting. And I painted in oils, and mostly the Australian trees that were all around where I lived, that I'd looked at for 30 years wondering how I would paint them. It was a challenge. There was a lot of trial and error. I was learning to understand oil paint as well as painting in general. But these are some of the trees I painted, or more often than not, the canopies, because it was the ways that foliage captured light that was what really attracted my interest and was my inspiration. Now, a brush with paint is very different to a fine liner with ink and lines. There is value that you want to represent as well as colour to juggle. So it wasn't those things that were the advantage for me. But when I looked back, I realised that what was relevant to my ink drawing of trees from my painting days was the way I had to see to paint, the way I had to observe to paint, the way I had to understand the foliage of the tree canopies to paint, especially in the big tree canopies. I had to learn to see the canopy, not the leaves. I had to see the big picture, not the small detail. I had to see the total mass of foliage or masses of foliage and the way the light hit them, whatever shade that created, whatever shadows were cast, and how these affected the, if you like, local colour of it all. And while trees have edges, with a brush and with value and colour to juggle, I had flexibility to create soft or hard edges with varied value, depending on the size of the leaves, the scale of the tree, and the distance within the painting's depth of plane. I very seldom painted individual leaves. Mostly, in fact, I particularly tried not to suggest leaves by my brushstrokes that could be mistaken as individual leaves, because that would change the perception of the size of the scale of the tree. But I focused on understanding the overall form of the canopy, the three-dimensional elements, where everything sat in space in relationship to its other parts. And where the sky shone through was just as important as the foliage. In fact, I often painted the tree by painting the sky through it. And although I first started to draw with pencil, I used pencil lines I never shaded with the pencil held at an angle. And without realising it, I used my established focus on the overall form and creating the three-dimensional effect of the light on the canopies, but using lines, which in effect meant I was using hatching to replicate the effect of the overall form. And this is where my thinking of capturing with my marks the effect rather than the outline or the detail came from. Because with painting, that was a natural way to go. That was a natural focus to have, capturing the effect. I realised that when I saw a tree canopy, I wasn't thinking of something like this that I was trying to draw. But when I first looked, what I was actually seeing was something more like this. And the fact that in Australia, a lot of eucalyptus trees, our gum trees, are more like this than this, probably helped me to do so. I saw it as a way of simplified forms, that this is the way I'd come to see the canopies when I was painting. And I found this is the way with the paint. I would, if you like, rough in the underpainting, and then I would refine it, and I could refine the edges, and I could add sky coming through in parts. And I realized when I was drawing that I was doing the same thing. And this can be seen perhaps a little more easily in a fast gestural drawing of a tree. How these highly simplified blobs, but each of which has form and collects light and shade and casts shadow, is now represented. And I use line and hatching to, in effect, capture this, but in a somewhat more tree-like way. And this was something that could be applied with more detail on foliage. Or sometimes the tree was more of a complete foliage. There weren't as many smaller canopies. Sometimes the pattern of light and dark was quite complex and took more time to do. Sometimes the canopies were in effect very small, but the principle was the same. And just as in the painting, paying particular attention to the silhouette edges. And whereas with paint, I tried to get often a very soft edge, with line, I found I had to adjust my marks to create, in my thinking, the softest edge I could. But this system worked for very large trees as well. It was also effective for very different trees. And I found it worked well for trees that were close, further away, or very far away, even in quite complex scenes. It worked in effect for small shrubby bushes as well. Even if they had quite a jagged, angular form, I could still capture this form. These weren't rounded blobs of foliage, but they still had a shape, they still had a form, albeit pointy. But there will be marks for whatever form the foliage is creating. And that effect can change according to the scale, the distance that we're seeing. And sometimes when we're further away, the form blurs more. And it's easier to see, if you like, the canopy blobs. But sometimes that also can be made quite complex by shade and shadow. And yet with a complex scene such as this, the way I came to see the tree canopies when I painted proved to be extremely effective, extremely transferable to using an ink line. Again, even for quite complex scenes, the same principle was at work. Focus on the edges, focus on capturing the three-dimensional form, not trying to see leaves, seeing a three-dimensional form, and using hatching lines particularly to capture the silhouette. In the same way that with the brush, I used paint that juggled various combinations of colour and value, lightness and darkness, to create this effect. By hatching, I could create a similar effect that worked well for very different types of trees. And it was also a style that particularly suited joining architecture with trees as well. And for some scenes, this same way of thinking, this same method, worked very well in combination with ink for the value, where there's hatchwork, albeit a lighter amount of hatchwork, because it could be strengthened with various values of ink rather than more hatching. And while sometimes this is a laborious technique to use, I came to realize it was a worthwhile investment because of the effect of foliage that it could create. And what I particularly like about this way of drawing that comes from this way of thinking is that when we have subjects where there is foliage, but there's other objects as well, that because there is a wonderful, I think, harmony between the foliage elements and the other non-foliage elements, because They've all come from ink marks on the paper, and often the effect has been created by hatching through a lot of very short lines close together, but placed with great variety and in a very deliberate and chosen way. But there is great flexibility within this method for creating quite varied and distinct effect, which might be lost in a tangle in other methods. Now, it wasn't just tree canopies I painted. I painted a lot of the Australian waratah. But what I found was that the same level of observation and understanding of form, of three-dimensionality, was of invaluable help in capturing the effect of a waratah using ink line on paper. Ink line, ink marks are a wonderfully flexible and rich way to create a whole range of visual effects. But I can't help but still think that painting for 10 years before I really did any drawing at all really was a tremendous advantage for me. G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Look, I hope you found this little insight into my personal art journey, but also into my thinking and processing and development of my drawing interesting. If you did, please hit the like button for me. But in the end, we're all on our own journey, and whatever you draw and however you draw, trees or otherwise, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.